This is the chilling, true story that shocked Japan and the world. A young girl, only 16, kidnapped, tortured, and left to suffer in unimaginable ways for 44 days. Her name, Junko Furuta. What happened to her defies all belief, but the haunting truth is one that can no longer be ignored. In today's video, we'll dive deep into the case that not only left an indelible mark on society, but also sparked a conversation about the darkness hidden in the corners of our world. From the harrowing details of the crime to the long road to justice, this is a story like no other. Join us as we explore every shocking angle, every unanswered question, and the truth that many are still unwilling to face. This is the full, unfiltered analysis of the Junko Furuta case. Only here you can have the most complete view. Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where shadows hide the truth. On the night of November 25th, 1988, Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old high school student, vanished without a trace in Tokyo, Japan. Her disappearance would lead to one of the most harrowing and tragic cases in Japanese criminal history. At the time, Junko was on her way home from her part-time job, unaware that she was about to become the victim of a crime so horrific it would haunt Japan for decades. For weeks, her family and friends desperately searched for her, unaware of the unspeakable horrors she was enduring behind closed doors. In the following days, the police investigated, but no clear leads surfaced. What the police didn't know was that Junko's captors were not just ordinary criminals. They were a group of teenage boys, driven by violence, with no clear reason behind their sadistic actions. As the investigation unfolded, the police began to piece together a terrifying story. Junko was abducted by 4 young men, Yasushi Watanabe, Hiroshi Miyano, and 2 others, who kept her captive in a small, run-down house for over 2 months. The details of what happened to Junko during that time are too disturbing for many to fully comprehend, but it is essential to understand the extent of her suffering. Her captors tortured her relentlessly, physically, mentally, and emotionally, for more than 40 days. The horrific abuse she endured was unimaginable: starvation, beatings, and repeated assaults. They even forced her to perform unspeakable acts, all while threatening her with death. Despite the unimaginable suffering, Junko never gave up hope of escape. She attempted to call for help on numerous occasions, but her captors were always watching, always ready to silence her. As the days turned into weeks, her health deteriorated rapidly. Yet, Junko's spirit remained unbroken. She fought against her captors with every ounce of strength she had left. Her abduction and the abuse she suffered went unnoticed by anyone for weeks, until, in January 1989, the police were finally tipped off by an anonymous source who had learned about the horrific events. By the time the authorities arrived, Junko's life had already been tragically cut short. Her body was discovered in a state so horrifying that it would leave investigators in shock and disbelief. The truth about what happened to Junko Furuta came to light, but the details were almost too disturbing to accept. The public was horrified, the justice system shaken, and Japan as a whole was forced to confront the grim reality of the crime. As the investigation deepened, the police soon learned that Junko's captors were not unfamiliar with the law. Hiroshi Miyano, the leader of the group, was an 18-year-old high school dropout with a history of criminal behavior. His violent tendencies were already well known in his community, but his actions had always been ignored or brushed aside. He had been involved in petty crimes before, but what he and his friends subjected Junko to would shock the nation. Miyano's accomplices, Yasushi Watanabe, 17, and 2 other minors, joined him in this unthinkable act of cruelty. They had all been friends for years, and it was clear from the beginning that this wasn't a random act of violence. They planned and executed Junko's abduction with alarming precision, knowing that their victim was vulnerable and far from any help. The torture Junko suffered began almost immediately after her abduction. Miyano and his friends held her captive in a house in the Ayase district of Tokyo, a neighborhood known for its neglect and dilapidated conditions. The house, which had no electricity, was isolated and offered no means of escape. For more than a month, Junko was subjected to unspeakable physical and psychological torture. Her captors repeatedly assaulted her, cutting her, burning her, and leaving her with serious injuries that would never heal. Despite this, they continued to torment her, making her endure humiliation and suffering on an unimaginable scale. During this time, Junko was denied basic needs, food, water, and medical care. Her body became weak, and her health rapidly deteriorated. Yet, even through the pain, Junko managed to summon the courage to escape at least twice. But each time she tried, her captors hunted her down, dragging her back into captivity and punishing her even more severely for her efforts. The case took a darker turn when one of the perpetrators, Yasushi Watanabe, eventually revealed the full extent of the crime to police. His confession would lay bare the horrific details of what had happened to Junko, including the heart-wrenching fact that she had been kept alive for as long as she had, only because of the brutal nature of her abusers. After Watanabe's confession, authorities finally found the remains of Junko Furuta. Her body was unrecognizable, bearing signs of the torment she had endured. The forensic evidence and witness testimonies confirmed the unimaginable. Despite the undeniable evidence, the trial would prove to be just as harrowing as the crime itself. The defense attorneys tried to downplay the severity of the situation, while the prosecution argued that the defendants should receive the harshest punishment possible. The trial of the four perpetrators, Miyano, Watanabe, and the other two minors, was a public spectacle, drawing widespread attention and outrage from the Japanese population. As the case unfolded in the courtroom, the gruesome details of Junko's suffering were laid bare for all to see, leaving many in tears, while others were left in disbelief that such cruelty could exist. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of the events, with the chilling testimonies of those who had been involved in the crime. The victims' families were in attendance, seeking justice for Junko, but their pain was matched by the frustration and anger of a public that demanded accountability. The evidence was irrefutable. Both physical and psychological abuse had been inflicted upon Junko for over a month, ultimately leading to her untimely death. During the trial, the defense attempted to argue that Miyano and his friends were not responsible for the death of Junko, claiming that she had died from a combination of her injuries and natural causes. This was a controversial defense, as there was clear evidence that Junko's death had been a direct result of the abuse inflicted upon her. Miyano, the leader of the group, attempted to minimize his role in the crime, but his contradictory statements and lack of remorse only served to further incriminate him. Witnesses who had seen Junko during the course of her captivity testified to her physical appearance, pale, bruised, and broken. The defense argued that the other minors involved should be given more lenient sentences, given their age, but the prosecution insisted that no one, regardless of their age, should be allowed to escape the consequences of such inhumane acts. It was clear that the brutality of the crime had left an indelible mark on society, and there was little tolerance for leniency in the case. Miyano was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in Junko's death. His accomplices received lesser sentences, though still significant, with some of them serving as few as 5 years before being released due to their age at the time of the crime. Many in Japan were horrified by the fact that the minors were granted reduced sentences, given the severity of the crime. Junko's case became a turning point in Japan, sparking public debates on juvenile justice and the responsibilities of the criminal justice system. The controversy surrounding the perpetrator's sentences revealed deep divisions in the country over the fairness of legal treatment for minors involved in violent crimes. As time passed, the case would continue to haunt those who followed it, with the painful memory of Junko's tragic death remaining in the hearts of the public. The case also drew attention to the dark undercurrents of societal violence, raising awareness about issues such as bullying, social alienation, and the treatment of vulnerable individuals within the community. Junko Furuta's death not only highlighted the horrific nature of the crime, but also led to conversations about how better protections and safeguards could be put in place for young people facing abuse. The aftermath of Junko Furuta's death left an indelible scar on the public psyche of Japan. The case sparked nationwide discussions on the darker aspects of youth violence and the social pressures that can contribute to such horrors. Although Junko's story became widely known, it was difficult for many to fully grasp the extent of her suffering and the inhumanity that surrounded it. In the years following the trial, Junko Furuta became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. Her story was told again and again, both in the media and in courtrooms, as the legal system continued to grapple with the proper way to handle cases involving minors committing heinous crimes. The public remained divided over whether the punishment handed down to the perpetrators was adequate. Some argued that the legal system had failed Junko, while others believed that justice had been served given the circumstances of the crime. The emotional impact of Junko's death was further amplified by the media's portrayal of the case. The media had an essential role in keeping the memory of Junko alive, and the sheer amount of coverage surrounding the case highlighted the need for stricter laws regarding juvenile offenders. However, the case also sparked conversations on the limits of media coverage and the potential risks of sensationalizing crimes, especially when the victim's suffering was so profound. As the years passed, the names of the perpetrators faded from the public eye, but for Junko's family, the pain of losing her remained. Her parents, who had hoped for a future filled with love and joy for their daughter, were left to grapple with an unthinkable loss. The trauma and emotional toll of the case haunted them, and they would never forget the harrowing details of how their child had been treated during her final days. The death of Junko Furuta and the trial that followed acted as a turning point in Japan's legal system, especially when it came to the treatment of minors in the criminal justice system. Public outrage over the leniency shown to some of the perpetrators sparked debates about the rehabilitation of juvenile offenders and whether the legal age for criminal responsibility should be redefined. At the same time, Junko's case brought to light the importance of social responsibility. It forced the public to ask difficult questions about how such cruelty could go unnoticed for so long and what could have been done to intervene. The lack of early intervention was a recurring theme in many discussions about the case, whether by the community, teachers, or parents. It pointed to a society that had failed to protect a vulnerable individual from the horrors that would ultimately lead to her death. Junko's legacy became one of awareness, sparking important conversations about the need to protect young people from violence and the importance of speaking out when something seems wrong. Her case highlighted the urgency of addressing not only criminal behavior, but also the social and emotional well-being of young people. In addition, the tragedy of Junko Furuta also shed light on how deeply ingrained societal issues, such as bullying, peer pressure, and mental health struggles, can affect the most vulnerable. The criminal actions of Miyano, Watanabe, and the others were a reflection of a society that, in many ways, had failed to address these issues head-on. As we move forward in this case, one of the most chilling aspects that became evident was the complicity of others who were aware of Junko's suffering. There were numerous people who knew what was happening to her, yet they chose to remain silent. The indifference of the community, including those who witnessed Junko's abduction or knew of her torment, became a disturbing reality. This culture of silence is one of the most perplexing aspects of the case, and it raises the question: how could so many people turn a blind eye to a teenager in unimaginable pain? The perpetrators themselves seem to have little remorse, even as they faced the consequences of their actions in the courtroom. It was clear that the brutal acts committed against Junko were not isolated incidents of spur-of-the-moment violence. They were premeditated, carefully executed acts of sadism. The level of cruelty demonstrated in this case made it impossible for people to understand how such violence could come from individuals so young. In the trial, the defense of the perpetrators centered around the argument that they were young and misguided. However, this argument fell flat when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the heinous nature of their actions. The victims' families, particularly Junko's parents, were left to wonder: could the authorities have intervened sooner? Was there enough done to protect Junko during the critical time that she was being held captive? Unfortunately, these questions lingered, unanswered. One of the major turning points in the investigation was when Miyano and the other perpetrators were apprehended. Their arrest came after they had already subjected Junko to hours, days, and weeks of unimaginable torment. But what followed was even more unsettling. Those responsible for her death were not held accountable in a way that would bring true justice for the crime. Many argued that the light sentences handed down were a reflection of the broken state of the juvenile justice system. This outrage at the legal outcomes only fueled the public's desire for reform. The case also raised issues surrounding Japan's justice system and the treatment of minors in the criminal justice system. At the time of Junko's case, Japan's age of criminal responsibility was lower than that of many other countries. This led to questions about whether those responsible for such heinous acts should be treated the same as adults, given the severity of their crimes. The sentencing of the perpetrators in Junko's case sparked a wave of legal and societal debate, especially when it became apparent that some of the individuals responsible for her suffering would soon be free. In the aftermath, the tragedy of Junko Furuta served as a catalyst for public outcry. Her case made clear that more needed to be done to protect vulnerable members of society, especially young people. Social awareness of juvenile violence grew, and so did the recognition of the need to address the psychological, emotional, and social factors that contribute to such brutality. There were calls for stricter penalties for minors involved in violent crime and stronger social protections to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future. As the legal proceedings unfolded, there was widespread media attention on Junko Furuta's case, which kept the public engaged and sparked ongoing debates. The horrific nature of the crime, coupled with the fact that the perpetrators were all minors, made the case a significant point of controversy. Many people in Japan were left questioning the moral compass of a society that allowed such violence to occur. How could such brutality go unnoticed for so long? And why didn't anyone step in to save Junko? The media coverage of the case was both a source of public outrage and a channel for continued discussion about the justice system and its ability to handle such crimes. It was not just the brutality of the act that shocked the nation, but the fact that Junko was held captive for over a month while her torturers inflicted unspeakable acts upon her. The lack of intervention from anyone, whether from bystanders or even those who may have known something, left the community grappling with feelings of guilt and shame. In Japan, the case became a symbol of the failure to protect vulnerable children, and Junko Furuta's name became synonymous with the loss of innocence. For many, her death became a wake-up call. Her parents, who had lost their daughter in the most unimaginable way, were left to pick up the pieces. They became outspoken advocates for child protection and legal reform, using their tragic loss to demand better treatment of victims and stricter penalties for those who commit such crimes. Despite their efforts, however, the justice system's response was often seen as insufficient. The perpetrators, some of whom were still minors at the time of the crime, received lighter sentences due to their ages, which sparked outrage among the public. For many, this was an example of a legal system that failed to adequately punish the offenders, especially given the horror of the crime. As the years passed, the case became a focal point for calls to change Japan's laws regarding the treatment of juvenile offenders. In the courtroom, the defense's argument that the offenders were young and impressionable was widely rejected. The prosecution painted a picture of individuals who were capable of extreme cruelty, suggesting that their actions were not a product of age, but of a deep-seated depravity. The fact that the perpetrators had the ability to plan, execute, and continue their torment of Junko for such an extended period was a key aspect of the trial. For the families involved, the pain of seeing the individuals who caused so much harm potentially receive lighter sentences was a slap in the face. Public response was fierce. The case became a rallying point for those advocating for stronger punishments for minors involved in violent crimes. There were calls for juvenile offenders to be treated as adults when it came to serious criminal acts, and for the justice system to take a more stringent stance on crimes like those committed against Junko Furuta. The broader societal impact was significant. Junko's case forced Japan to re-evaluate its approach to juvenile crime and its treatment of victims. As the years went by, Junko Furuta's case continued to linger in the minds of many. Her tragic death marked a pivotal moment in Japan's history, sparking national debates on how to deal with juvenile delinquency and the treatment of victims of horrific crimes. While the media had moved on to other stories, the case remained etched in the collective consciousness of the Japanese people. The public outrage didn't fade with time. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger as the question of justice remained unresolved. The light sentences given to the perpetrators ignited further discussions on the legal system and the age of criminal responsibility. How could young individuals, barely adults themselves, commit such acts of violence and yet not face the full consequences of their actions? The justice system's inability to address the crime with the severity it demanded left many wondering if there was something deeply flawed in the system. The fact that Junko Furuta's life was taken so violently and her suffering was prolonged for weeks on end only added to the collective grief felt by her country. The anguish felt by her family, who had lost a daughter in the most tragic manner imaginable, became a central focus. The pain of losing a loved one in such a way, compounded by the feeling that justice had not been served, became a burden that no parent should have to endure. For Junko's parents, there was no true closure. No amount of justice could bring their daughter back or erase the memories of what she had gone through. Her mother became a fierce advocate for victims of violence, using her personal loss to fuel efforts to protect other children from suffering the same fate. She traveled around Japan, speaking out about the importance of child protection laws and the need for a reform in the juvenile justice system. Her voice echoed through the halls of government, but for many, the change they sought still seemed elusive. The perpetrators of the crime, once convicted, continued to live out their lives, some even being released from prison as they served their sentences. The issue of their rehabilitation became another hotly debated topic. How could someone who had committed such an atrocity be allowed to reintegrate into society? The public's trust in the system began to erode further, as many believed that these individuals had not faced adequate punishment for their heinous actions. This only served to deepen the wound for the families involved. It wasn't until several years later that the case resurfaced in the media with renewed focus. By this time, there had been significant public pressure to revise Japan's laws regarding juvenile offenders. Advocates called for an overhaul of the justice system, one that would ensure that serious crimes committed by minors would be met with appropriate consequences. They argued that if a young individual could commit such an act of violence, they should be held fully accountable for their actions. The tragedy of Junko Furuta's case ultimately led to a shift in societal attitudes toward juvenile crime. It served as a stark reminder of the need for vigilance, for the protection of the vulnerable, and for justice to prevail, no matter the age of the perpetrator. As for Junko's family, while no amount of justice could heal their wounds, their continued advocacy for reform served as a testament to their daughter's memory and their fight to ensure that such a tragedy would never be repeated. The case of Junko Furuta became a symbol of the failure of the juvenile justice system in Japan, sparking nationwide debates about how to better handle serious crimes committed by minors. The media, now fully aware of the tragic details, continued to report on the case intermittently, focusing on the atrocities Junko had suffered and the public's growing frustration with the legal system's response. As more details about the crime were exposed, there was growing concern over the extent to which the perpetrators had been allowed to manipulate the justice system. At the time of their arrests, all 4 of the young men involved were under 18, which meant they were technically considered minors under Japanese law. But the brutality of their actions challenged the notion of what should be considered acceptable behavior for someone of such a young age. The primary question that many people raised was whether age should be an excuse for cruelty of this magnitude. How could such young individuals, in a society as orderly as Japan, be capable of committing such horrific acts? This question resonated deeply with the public, especially as they learned more about the victim's struggle for survival. Junko's pain and suffering became a symbol for those advocating for changes in the laws surrounding juvenile offenders. In the years following the trial, one of the most contentious aspects of the case was the fact that the perpetrators were able to serve relatively short sentences. The fact that they were released back into society with what many considered insufficient punishment added fuel to the fire. For the families and victims' advocates, the notion that the offenders were rehabilitated, especially after committing such heinous crimes, seemed like a slap in the face. One of the offenders, Hiroshi Miyano, was one of the more notorious figures involved in the crime. His history of violence and lack of remorse made him a focal point for public outrage. His conviction, which included a 20-year sentence, was seen by many as far too lenient, considering the sheer brutality of his actions. His eventual release from prison, after serving only a portion of his sentence, caused further public outcry. People began to question the effectiveness of the juvenile justice system in Japan. Over time, however, some legal reforms were implemented in Japan as a result of the public pressure stemming from cases like Junko Furuta's. Changes were made to the way juvenile offenders were treated in the criminal justice system, particularly when it came to cases involving violent crime. Efforts were made to increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility and to ensure that those who committed violent acts faced sentences that were in proportion to their crimes. Although these reforms marked a step forward in the legal system's approach to juvenile crime, for the families affected by cases like Junko's, these changes often felt like too little, too late. Their painful memories of what happened to their loved ones remained unresolved, and they continued to fight for justice, knowing that no legal change could undo the suffering they had endured. For the public, the case also highlighted the larger issue of youth violence in Japan. While Japan is often seen as a safe and orderly country, The Furuta case brought to light the disturbing reality that violence, even in its most extreme forms, can occur anywhere. It forced the country to examine the darker side of its society, where some youths seem to harbor deep-seated anger and hatred, capable of acting out in the most violent ways. The Junko Furuta case is often referred to as one of the most horrific crimes in modern Japanese history, and its impact was far-reaching. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, her legacy lives on, inspiring those who fight for justice and the protection of the vulnerable. It's essential that we continue to ensure that the voices of victims are heard and that justice is served, no matter how long it takes.